Hello, Burnsville Psych students. This lesson is going to be about modern approaches to psychology, otherwise known as schools of thought. From the picture, you can see that one way to think about these schools of thought or these approaches is to think of the different lenses on a camera. When you think about different lenses and what a photographer can do, um, it's fairly apparent that a wide-angle lens will give you a different picture than a zoom lens or one of those fishbowl lenses. You get a different result because you're using a different lens. When we're thinking about psychology, we can think about the problems or the questions that psychologists wrestle with using different lenses as well, which leads us to the approaches to psychology. Now, a careful look at the syllabus for the class will easily show you that the different schools of thought might relate to the different units that we study. For example, our first unit, once we get through some introductory material, is to look at sociocultural psychology, which we're calling social psychology, the same thing. Second unit we have listed as brain and consciousness. So the body and behavior and states of consciousness fit well within biological psychology. In states of consciousness, we might pull in some other things as well. As you go through the syllabus, you'll know that these schools of thought will pop up from unit to unit. So what are the schools of thought? Starting with sociocultural psychology, the questions related to sociopsychology that psychologists will ask have to do with how ethnicity, gender, culture, socioeconomic status, all of those kinds of things influence our behavior. In social psychology, we're talking about groups and the influence that groups have on individuals. So it makes sense that within this lens, the sociocultural lens, we are talking about how these issues related to groups and our society influence our behavior and our mental processes. Second school of thought we have listed here is biological psychology. And anyone that's taken a biology class would be able to understand that we are talking about things like your brain, your nervous system, genetics, and the impact or the influence that those have on our behavior, on our thought processes. So a psychologist that is coming from a biological psychology approach might look at a certain problem from a completely different lens than someone coming from a sociocultural approach. For example, if we were going to talk about something like depression, and we're going to try to figure out what is responsible for this person's depression, someone coming from a biological approach might look at the impact that different chemicals in a person's brain might have on their depression. For example, they might look at something like serotonin and levels of serotonin in the brain. In order to fix that, if that's indeed what we find is the problem that leads to the depression, we might try to correct the balance of chemicals that exist in that person's brain. That fits well within the biological psychology approach. If somebody is coming from a sociocultural perspective, looking at something like depression, they might think about other things like, do you see depression more prevalent in males or females? Does culture have an impact on depression? Things like that. Now, one problem that we have when we're talking about the approaches in the schools of thought is that sometimes students will think of these as completely separated from each other. And frankly, working psychologists are probably likely to draw on multiple approaches. But for the sake of our class and for the sake of introduction, let's keep plowing forward. Humanistic psychology talks about individual choice and how human beings, thus the humanistic part, how human beings influence their behavior based off of the choices that they make, based off the way they approach certain problems. That seems a little murky and a little bit, what we need would be a good example here. In order to do that, let's jump down to psychoanalytic psychology. Somebody coming from the psychoanalytic school of thought or approach looks at the influence that our unconscious mind has on our behavior. So right here you should be thinking of people like Sigmund Freud or Jung or some other psychoanalytic psychologists. They are looking at all of this stuff that's lurking down deep in our mind that we don't even have access to, and how that impacts our behavior. For example, Freud talks about things like, you know, how long you were breastfed by your mother, and the impact that that might have on things like how tidy or messy you are as an adult. Um, Humanistic psychologists thought about all of this Freudian or psychoanalytic business and said that might be a little limiting. Perhaps the person is messy because they are choosing to not make neatness a priority. So again, the lens that we use, the approach that we use to psychological problems or issues is going to influence the kinds of things we think about and the way we approach those issues or problems. Last two on this list, we have cognitive psychology and behavioral psychology. So a cognitive psychologist is going to look at how we process, store, and retrieve information and how all of that influences behavior. Frankly, when we're talking about cognitive psychology, we're talking about a lot of the things that you do in school, learning and memory, and how all of that has an impact on who you are as a human being. Fairly straightforward, fairly specific. Behavioral psychologists look at learning from a slightly different angle, and they would talk about how our environment influences our behavior. And specifically in our environment, we're talking about things like rewards and punishment. So if I am a straight A student, partly because I like getting good grades and I like the praise that comes with getting good grades, or maybe even my parents have decided that uh, every A I get on my report card will earn me $20 or something like that. Those are the kinds of rewards that might be influencing my behavior to study and to do the work of a student. So to wrap this up, as we go throughout the semester, we will be talking about these approaches. We will be referencing these approaches, and don't be surprised to hear the use of sociocultural or social psychology or biological psychology. For now, what you need to understand is that when we're thinking about psychology, when we're thinking about how to approach the problems and questions that come up in this field, that psychologists have um, historically applied certain lenses to their work. And as we go, we will delve into these all in much more detail. That's it for now. Have a good night.